Hey, welcome everybody joining us today on this, which is session two of day two. We're really excited about this one. My name is Brent Thurgood. I'm the head of people at Enerflo. We're lucky to be joined by Benoit Thanjan, who is the founder and CEO of Renew Energy and Solar Maverick podcast. I think a lot of us have heard podcasts, so welcome, Benoit. We
Thank
also
you.
are lucky to have David Kenny, who's the co-founder and COO of Omnidian. And so, welcome, David, to the podcast. Like I'm running a podcast. This is just a session, guys, not a podcast. And we've got our co-founder and CEO, Pat Bennett. So we'll let everybody get started. Thanks. I'll turn it over to you, Benoit, for the conversation.
Thank thank
Brent.
you, bro, and thank you to Enerflo for making this virtual summit, which I've been listening to some of the previous, I'm not going to say podcasts, but previous sessions, and it's been really great. I've learned a lot from it. And as we all know who are part of the solar coaster, everything's changes so quickly, and we have to keep innovating to continue to be successful. And this is actually a great panel. It's called the Benefits of Third Party Ownership, Lease PPA or Power Purchase Agreement, which I think everyone should be pretty familiar with. It obviously increased residential sales once these products became popular because of no money down, lowering your energy cost and having solar. I think maybe it would be great if I think probably our audience knows Pat because he was in previous sessions, but maybe if David, you could start off and give a brief introduction as the founder and CEO of Omnidian and what you're doing in the TPO space to start off.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. My name is David Kenny. He, him pronouns. I live up in the Pacific Northwest in a little neighborhood outside of Seattle, Washington, and really looking forward to the session here today. Thank you for inviting Omnidian to participate. I got started in the solar industry a long time ago, back before the power purchase agreement was a thing, and got started on the commercial side of things at Renewable Ventures, and then made my way into the resi space by joining Sunrun back in the early days at Sunrun, and then parlayed that into helping Mark and Ray and others start Omnidian now almost 7 years ago. Omnidian is active in the solar industry in both residential and commercial, and our primary focus is on working with assets after they've been installed. We don't have a role to play at point of sale. We're not procuring equipment. We're not installing systems, but we're monitoring the performance of them after they've been installed and then helping to manage the performance and any required service activity that goes into that. And over that period of time, we've seen the ebb and flow of the industry. Change is the obvious only constant here, where the consumer preferences have shifted back and forth from third-party ownership to first-party ownership with leases and loans, and then more recently back to the TPO model. So excited to dig into that a bit further here on this session.
Definitely, that's a great introduction. Pat, it would be great. I know you've been in some prior sessions, but to give an introduction to yourself and Enerflow as well.
Yeah, I think sometimes when I'm on these, I'm saying I'm like 6 years in solar, and that's like I'm like a noob because some of you guys have been in for much longer. But I've tried to be a quick study. Spencer and I started the company about 6 years ago. It's crazy it's been that long, but we've just been on a mission to let software really play a better role in driving down the costs and bringing efficiency and trying to do that any way we can. So I have a software engineering background. This is my fourth company that I've founded, and just excited about the space. We've had a lot of fun learning, and the transition to TPO over the last year has been very exciting. I've had to learn a lot about what PPA means and some of those things that you've been talking about. But yeah, it's great to see us find new creative ways to let the consumer buy. And at the end of the day, that's what we're really trying to do, is just help them get into a system as easy as possible, but best for them. And for some people, it is best to get a lease or PPA, and some people it's best to purchase. So I'm excited to have this discussion.
Thanks, Pat. And I'll just give a brief introduction. As was said before with Brian, I have a podcast called the Solar Maverick Podcast. We've had the podcast since 2018. We have 170 episodes, and it's one of the most popular podcasts in solar. You could find it on all your podcast channels. We actually had Spencer from Enerflo on the podcast. It's episode 128 about how Enerflo is revolutioning the residential sales process. So you definitely should check that out. And then that's just my hobby. My real business is Renew Energy. We're a solar development and consulting firm based in Jersey City, New Jersey, and San Diego, California. We develop commercial, industrial, community solar, and utility scale projects, and we're also involved in RECs. I can't believe I've actually been now in the solar industry and energy for 20 years. Before I started my company 13 years ago, I was at Tesla, Solar City, Vanguard Energy Partners, which is a solar EPC, and then Ridgewood Renewable Power private equity fund that invested in renewables, and Deloitte in their energy consulting group. So it's just been amazing to see how everything's changing so quickly. It's interesting, Pat, you talking about TPO being back this year, whereas people were going back to self-ownership. And I think obviously with interest rates and a changing environment, people still want to reduce their energy costs, and TPO gives them the opportunity to do that. Can you talk about like why you've seen a trend of TPO this year becoming more popular than it has in years past, and the change of why you think that happened?
I'd say a lot of people would point to rising interest rates, right? When money was free, that was the way to buy solar. It's you could finance it so cheap. These 25-year 0.99 loans, it was just crazy. That was even an option. So I think when money was free and borrowing purchase came in, and a lot of progressive companies changing the model, like Mosaic and GoodLeap and Dividend, really like coming out with these creative ways to finance for a long period of time. And I think that reps just found that as a new way to sell and to talk through. As interest rates go up and those dealer fees increase and those APRs keep going higher and higher, from a marketing standpoint, it doesn't quite sound as good to finance for 25 years 899, right? That doesn't have the same ring to it. I think the other side of it is probably access to capital. We've seen a lot of new capital come into this space, a lot of funds, a lot of appetite for tax equity, and people realizing that resi is a great way to deploy those assets. And so I think the combination of the two, and then company reps had to adjust. Reps coming into the space 2019, 2020, they probably weren't selling many leases at all. But as interest rates started increasing, technology started improving, you could do a lease transaction outside of a hub like Sunrun or Sonova, those kind of more closed systems. More software companies were able to integrate with new asset providers, and you could do a TPO job on a software platform as easy as finance. And I think that really started the snowball of people realizing like, oh, this is a great option for me to give to my customers when interest rates maybe make it a little more burdensome to buy. Sure, David probably has some ideas too on the turn, but that's what I've seen.
Yeah, I think that's all spot on, Pat. The only additional three-letter acronym I would drop into the conversation here is the IRA, and some of the tailwinds that the IRA has provided to the tax equity investor community specifically. And that's helped pull, as Pat mentioned, some more capital interest into the space, which has shifted things back towards the TPO product line.
David, that's actually a great point, and both of you make great points about how has like the IRA. I know in the previous session, Julia was talking about how August is the 2-year anniversary of actually the IRA. How has like transferability and transfer rules, which I think maybe David you're referring to, helped with maybe making the TPO product more popular?
It's funny, it almost feels like we're still in that transition. I would have had to really close my eyes and think about it to place that 2-year anniversary milestone. It doesn't feel like it's been 2 years, and it feels like there's still a lot ahead of us to really realize the benefits and spirit of that legislation. With that said, it has certainly entered into conversation and is influencing things like domestic content and labor rates that are going into install and some maintenance activity. And it's starting to influence how people are thinking about these financing structures going forward. And in the near term, it's really provided some more air cover for those folks to come to the table and put more capital into the space. It feels like we're at the tail end of kind of a transition or purgatory period here.
Yeah, definitely. That's a great point. For example, the transferability, the final rules really haven't been, it was only, I think, finalized maybe 2 months ago. So still.
Yeah, it's generating interest in giving more air cover for the conversations.
That makes sense. And can you talk about, I know, David, you talked about Omnidian and where you guys are in the market, but can you talk about how Omnidian has shifted from trying to sell directly to installers, but now you're really the back end for lenders, and why maybe that has changed over time?
Yeah, so Omnidian's value prop, or what we do, if you scratch away at the surface of it and dig down into the guts of the business, we've built a capability to manage the performance of assets. And for us, that means finding performance issues and then solving those performance issues. And the folks who benefit from that service are generally the people who own the system or are exposed to the costs and risks of system performance. And to your point, 18 months ago, that was primarily an individual homeowner. And we were in market working directly through installers to sign contracts with individual homeowners to support their system and help manage their risk exposure to the operations of that asset. As the TPO product type has really taken share here, and we've seen new entrants into that space, the profile of the asset owner has just fundamentally changed, and it's back to this abstract entity or concept of a tax equity fund and a developer or servicer that sit around that ecosystem. And we are now seeing a lot of volume come onto our platform from those TPO developer sponsors and funds. And those are now our clients because they own the asset and they have exposure to the risks and costs of the operations of those assets. So we've seen, to a certain extent, continuity in what we're doing under the hood, but our go-to-market motion and our client profile has certainly changed over this cycle.
That's pretty interesting to see how quickly it changed. And I know Pat mentioned some of the capital providers in the space that are interested. It sounds like you're seeing a lot of new entrants, as you said. Is it unique sort of investors that don't have a background in solar, or they're just comfortable with the residential asset class, or the way the product's
Well,
structured? I don't know.
you've got a couple different stakeholders who come together to make this happen. You've got the business model of the developer, and I think that's what we're getting into now, where we're seeing new entrants into the space who are competing against some of the incumbent names like Sonova or Sunrun or Tesla. And then behind that business model, there's a whole capital finance team that's pulling in finance both in the form of debt and tax equity to capitalize the structures of those funds. So it's both of those ingredients, right? You got the business model of the developer that's new and coming into the space, and then you've got the back end capital sources that are ultimately funding those projects.
Oh, that's really interesting. And I know we briefly talked about the third-party ownership, but is there anything that we haven't talked about that might be beneficial to the audience, or maybe how the structures have changed over time, even TPO? David, you were working before there was even TPO, so you've seen like the whole life cycle, and then it being so popular, the self-financing, obviously, we talked about that before, but then now is it structured differently, or is it still the same sort of structuring that you've seen in the
It's still a similar, at its core, it's still a similar structure, right? From a capital finance perspective, you've got tax equity funds, tax equity providers, and then the developer business model pulling out capital by layering debt and pulling forward those future cash flows. So that at that level, it's still similar. Some of the changes are the introduction of the battery component itself and attach rates on batteries and some of the implications on point of sale, design, install, operations, etc. And then stepping back, one of the things that we haven't talked about yet is just some of the more practical implications of ownership. Sometimes the TPO and PPA acronyms get tossed around, maybe without fully appreciating the implication of what that actually means. And as it relates to a conversation at the kitchen table with a homeowner homeowner, a counterparty who's thinking about going solar, the benefits to the homeowner are pretty big, right? The homeowner is now not putting out any capital up front. They're buying energy at a price point that is at or below what they're paying to their utility. And from Omnidian's perspective, and perhaps most importantly, they're not taking on any risk exposure to the operation of that system going forward. Now, on the flip side of that, the developer, who's now the back-end platform that's selling that paper, is inheriting that risk. And the value of that contract, the value of that asset, is now linked one for one with the performance of that asset and the amount of energy that it produces over time, which means it's very important right up front for that developer to understand how much energy the system should perform. And now we're pulling in topics like change orders, system design accuracy, shade reports, and the simulation model itself that combines all of those inputs into a P50 performance estimate. And then over time, the monitoring, managing, and responsiveness to system alerts and fixing it. So all of that stuff comes together to provide the underwritten value of the asset in the form of that output, which is just it's a different calculus. It's a different set of motivations from the previous approach of cash and loan sales, where homeowners took that on themselves.
Definitely. There's so many interesting points that you made from that. Just curious about, like, where are you seeing what states are most popular for solar plus storage TPO product? Because I'd still think it's relatively new. And then how do you structure the storage too? Because that seems a lot more complicated.
Yeah, the storage attach rates are, I guess, from a macro perspective, still nascent, but growing quickly. And then as you zoom in to particular markets, you'll see attach rates that are just off the charts. And you go into the more traditional markets like California, Hawaii, even Florida now starting to increase. And you see some of those numbers really ramping quickly. From Omnidian's perspective, as it relates to install quality and then post-install management, one of the challenges that we're seeing right now across the industry is around CT installation. So these batteries, in order for a battery system to work correctly, you have to understand the net energy flows in and around that system. And CTs, current transformers, are installed as part of that. And it's just tough to get those installed in the correct location and in the correct relative orientation. And we see error rates that are very high. They've been coming down over time, but they're still much higher than where they will be in another year as the industry continues to mature.
Yeah, that's really helpful to know. And then I was also wondering about technology. Like, I would think at this point, lithium ion batteries is the only type that's really getting financed. What do you see, David, from Omnidian's perspective? Have you seen other technologies outside of lithium ion being put in?
We've seen, yeah, tying this back to the TPO construct, there's the third-party owner, as they take on the liability and responsibility of owning that asset, has the concept of an approved vendor list. So there's a lot of battery technology out there right now. There's a pretty short list of mainstream players that kind of dominate the market. Then there's a pretty long list of new entrants who are trying to get in. From the TPO perspective, it's really that short list of mainstream players that makes it out into those installations. A couple of exceptions to that, but in general, from the TPO perspective, we're really seeing a high concentration from the market leaders.
Oh, that makes total sense. And another great point that you mentioned, it was about performance. And obviously, when you're working with investors, they don't want to obviously see underperformance of the system. You talked about ways of helping ensure the performance of the system. Can you go into more detail about that?
Yeah, great question. Underperformance is a relative concept, right? A is not equal to B. Actual is not equal to expected. That delta or gap could be because either the actual performance has a problem and there's some performance issue that needs to be remediated, or it could be because the actual performance is actually just fine. It's doing what the system is inherently capable of doing, but the expected value was underwritten incorrectly. For example, solar access values were pegged at 100% every month, but there's a big effing tree on the south side of the home. So we have a way of focusing and looking at both the accuracy of the expected value and maintaining the ongoing continuity in that actual value. The actual value and thinking about performance over time would get into performance monitoring, alerts, and characterizing alerts with root cause and remediation activity to fix problems as they come up. Circling back to expected production, we have a concept of performance verification where we throw some additional analytics at a system's performance immediately after it's been installed to allow us to develop a perspective on behalf of the TPO owner of what the system is inherently capable of doing. And then we can compare that to what was sold in the contract and give some confidence or peace of mind that the system was built correctly and the specifications all came through the system correctly. But it's both sides of that coin that you've got to be thinking about.
Maybe just to chime in there, that I think there's been a wake-up call for people transitioning to TPO of the change order rate. And I think in a lot of cases, it's higher than finance. And I think a lot of people weren't really expecting that. They're like, oh, TPO, it's a little easier sale, cool. But then they realize, crap, if I don't do the right things up front, there's going to be a change order. And we know change order in this industry is like a curse word. No one wants to hear that because of going back to the customer, trying to renegotiate, tell them, hey, I was wrong. Here's what it needs to be. You mentioned shading, and we were talking to a design panel yesterday. And really, one of the discussion points we had was, what is the responsibility of the design tool itself? And then what is the responsibility of the sales rep? And maybe I want you to touch on that a little bit, David. If you were like, hey, if I was a rep of Nidhi and everything you guys see, if I was a rep in a home, here's the things I would do additionally on top of what my design tool might be telling me, because there seems to be responsibility from both sides. And we can't just say, oh, the design tool said it, so I'm good. What are some of those things like a rep in the home should be doing on a TPO project if you had a magic wand?
That feels like a loaded question. And I'm sensitive to the fact that this is being recorded. I'll try to walk the line here, but I think in general, and I'd be interested to go back and listen to that session because I didn't get a chance to plug into that yesterday, but in general, the human part of the input to the system is around characterizing or at the very least validating that the description of the 3D environment is accurate. The responsibility of the simulation tool is to then take those inputs, do a bunch of math, define a typical weather year, and produce as an output the expected energy value, which is a long-winded way of saying the human in the loop there is, in most cases, defining the 3D environment. And by that, chimneys, shading, obstacles, tree height, type of tree, does it shed through the off season or not? If you can get those inputs correct, most of these simulation tools are doing a great job of running the math and figuring out how much energy will come out. The problem typically comes into play where there's a lack of time or controls or focus or training around the definition of that 3D site environment. And you've got some simulation tools that are taking their approach of de-risking that by automating it. So now you're just typing in an address and the simulation tool itself is trying to figure out where the tree is and how tall it is. But not all design systems are doing that yet. So we're still, as an industry, kind of navigating the collective responsibility of figuring out those inputs and how to ensure they're accurate.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And then, David, can you talk about maybe innovation, specifically with technology and maybe even AI for qualifying good projects that will meet the performance expectations of investors?
So that's where Omnidian has really focused its time and resource over the last, really since inception, is building out the technology and software backbone that is capable of doing just that. The way we think about this is the production signals, the performance signals coming off of these distributed assets are time series data. There's a lot of data that's there. It's a very rich data set. And if you can pull in that rich data set across a portfolio of lots and lots of assets and throw a data science approach on top of it, you can do a lot to pull out anomalies from that time series data and characterize the root cause or issue that might be leading to that anomaly, and then marry that with the next step to remediate and act on it. At a high level, that's what we're talking about, right? And then to dig into that, it's what type of data science models and what area of the data science community are you tapping into in order to do that? And that's where some of the secret sauce stuff comes into play. But in general, you're trying to derive as much insight as possible from that production data stream coming off of the device.
Definitely, that's great to know, and I really appreciate you explaining it. Can you also talk about, I don't know if this is outside of what you do, David. We're seeing obviously electricity prices increasing over time, a lot of like expectations of load growth with the energy transition, data centers, AI. What are you seeing with inflation factors in TPO contracts? Because I know that's always a big issue with the residential customer. It's hard to predict, obviously, what 20 to 25 years of energy rates are going to be and whether they'll have those savings. And sometimes way back, it would have been better to just not have an inflation factor in the PPA.
So just to level set on terminology, you're saying inflation factor. I think we're talking about the escalator for the
escalator
price that
yes.
the homeowner pays. Yeah. Yeah. When you're putting together the proposal and you're at the kitchen table, there are two escalators that mathematically make their way into that collateral. One is an escalator that describes an assumption for where utility prices will go in the future. So that's the commodity that you're deferring. And the other is the escalator that goes into the price that you will pay, you, the homeowner, will pay to the asset owner, the TPO provider, for energy over time. The relationship between those two then defines the shape of savings in the out years in the proposal. I think what you're getting at is how the industry is approached thinking about what those two inputs are. One of them is indicative of the utility, and our industry has typically used numbers around 3-4% for that input. And then the other is the escalator on the PPA rate. And our industry has played around with anything from 0, where it's just a fixed flat number, all the way up to numbers that are higher than that. And that can have a pretty big impact on the proposal and ultimately the turnkey install price that an installer gets from the TPO platform, because the higher that escalator goes, the more contracted cash flow you're seeing in the out years, which can then be pulled forward through these structured finance mechanisms and turned into a higher appetite to pay a larger turnkey install price. So there's a circular set of factors that kind of feed on one another. Is that kind of what you were thinking about?
Yeah, you did a great job. That was the question, and you did a great job of actually really going into all the details of that, because it's pretty complicated. I know from a homeowner perspective when they first see that.
The mechanics of it, the framework of that is sound. I mean, it is, we just talked through it. I think what you're really asking is like, where is the industry today in terms of its tolerance on the input to the escalator in the TPO contract? I'm a step disconnected from that. So I don't have a comment on what numbers typically being used there now.
Yeah, but that's also really helpful that you explained that, because you need to know that. And obviously the financing community wants to be more conservative, right? On the sorry, I'm trying to use the terminology that you were using versus the developer, right? Who would want a higher rate. Yeah.
The worst case, the doomsday scenario is the TPO platform has missing or loose controls over what that escalator is. The point of sale party types in a number that's too big, and 10 years into the future, the PPA rate has escalated to a point where it is above what the homeowner would otherwise pay to their utility. And the homeowner is now effectively losing money on the value proposition of having solar on their roof. And there's some en masse movement by homeowners to simply stop paying those PPA bills. That's the scenario that the project finance community is motivated to protect against by being conservative and having some structure and rules in place that would preclude someone from selling an 8% escalator to a homeowner, even if the homeowner is willing to sign the contract on day zero.
Yeah, I will say from a technology standpoint, the lenders do put some safeguards in place. When you're building out these systems, typically on a given product, you'll be given like a 0 or 0.99, 199, up to 299, but a lot of times they don't let you go outside of that threshold. But it is more complicated for a rep to price a PPA because typically with loans, you're just picking a product, and a product is a combination of term and APR, essentially, where PPA is very different. You have a range of price per kilowatt hours you can choose from, then a range of escalators. And if you try to figure out how many combinations there are of those two, we're into the hundreds now of products, right? Of product combinations. So the other safeguard we're seeing providers put into place is once you put in that price per kilowatt, you put in that escalator, you run a first year savings analysis. And if they're not going to at least save in their first year, that's not going to, it won't let you actually apply. It is interesting you're bringing up year 10, right? Because I at least know they're looking at year 1 pretty clearly, but I don't know how much farther they look out and make that a requirement.
Yeah, and pricing, the whole topic just generally of pricing for PPAs and translating that into tolerance for install price, turnkey dollar per watt install price, is just inherently tough, right? Because again, it came up earlier in the conversation, but from the TPO perspective, the value of that asset is a function of its generation. So the system next door and the system on my house that are identical to one another, but there's a tree next door and no tree on my house, it's the same cost to procure, the same labor cost to install, but the value of the neighbor's asset is just fundamentally different because of that tree. So you've got to somehow, the TPO platforms have to figure out their pricing strategy and whether they price to a portfolio approach where they effectively peanut butter that stuff all around, and their tolerance to pay dollar per watt install price is the same for the two homes, or if they're going to go in the opposite direction of advanced, dynamic, intelligent pricing, whatever adjective you want to use there, to differentiate and say, no, we'll pay you a lot more to install the system that doesn't have the tree because it's more valuable to us. And we've seen TPO providers navigate that dynamic differently over the years.
This has been a great discussion. Is there anything else that we should talk about regarding the TPO product, or have we covered most of the important things?
I feel like we covered some good content for sure.
There's one question in the QA. I don't know if you guys saw that one.
Yeah, that actually could drive a good discussion. It's what is the risk with working with TPOs when looking for a long-term opportunity? SunPower's filing makes me cautious, right? So I guess that is a question we're seeing more and more. Company like SunPower, been around for a long time, good name in space, obviously having issues. So yeah, how should a individual installer think about that as they're deciding which funds to work with and maybe diversifying rather than going all in on one? Are there some trends or things you're seeing, David, or how installers might feel confident with the funds that they're sending jobs to?
I read the question similar to you, Pat, meaning when the person who asked the question asks about risk, I think that means risk to the installer.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think the question there then is what happens if the product that an installer is representing and selling is no longer available, and what is the implication or cost of then transitioning to a different product to represent? I think one general trend that we've seen is installers not having a one-to-one relationship with a financing product. We typically see installers having access to or the ability to represent financing products from more than one platform. And that in and of itself would give some protection to the installer in that scenario.
Yeah, that actually came up in our session yesterday morning with Ohm and Phil Shin, and that is a trend we've seen on the Enerflo platform as well. 18 months ago, people averaged about 2.5 installers. Now it's well over 3, or not installers, lender companies that they work with, finance partners. Now it's well over 3. The installer panel yesterday or today, they'll probably be talking a little bit about that too, of just the importance of diversifying your portfolio of lender companies you work with. It adds operational overhead, but it does reduce risk. And that's something I think everyone's working on right now, is just mitigating risk so we can continue to do well in this environment.
Anything else, guys?
I think it's been good.
Yeah.
Yeah, if there's no other QA, we can wrap it up. I felt like it was just you guys play a very interesting role in the market. I think it's one of those companies that maybe individual installers aren't aware they're actually working with, right? Because they might work with a finance partner, but not understand that you guys are actually doing the bankability studies and the performance monitoring after the fact for 25 years for these people. And you guys have a really good insight that I think a lot of other groups just don't have. So appreciate you joining, and of course you for leading the discussion. I think it's been really good.
Yeah, thanks again for including Nivian in the panel here.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Yeah, we appreciate it. Thanks for making time.